One kid in the middle of the playground, everyone else lined up at the far end, the moment just before someone decides to run. That is British Bulldog. 100 schools banned it. A generation of children played it anyway. More than a quarter of British teachers surveyed in 2011 said it had been banned at their school. Here's how a game with no equipment and no rules worth speaking of became the most controversial thing in British primary education. The game is simple enough to explain in 2 sentences. You run from one end of the playground to the other, and the person in the middle tries to stop you. If they do, you join them in the middle. The mob grows with every round. Last runner standing wins. That is the whole game. No ball, no score, no equipment beyond the ground you're standing on, and the people standing on it with you. It requires nothing except a space and the willingness to run at someone who is willing to run at you. And the result of those 2 things colliding is the reason it kept getting banned. The name is older than most people assume. Versions of the game appear in children's play records from the 1800s under various names: Black Man, Pom-Pom Pull-Away, Chinese Wall. The specific mechanics shifted depending on where it was played and who was playing it. But the name British Bulldog was adopted by the Boy Scouts of America during the Second World War, where it was associated with Winston Churchill and the particular quality of stubbornness under pressure that both the man and the dog were considered to represent. A game about standing in the middle of a field while everyone tries to get past you, named after a dog who famously refuses to let go. The name stuck, and it came back to Britain with it. The version that most British children remember from the 60s, 70s and 80s was played on the tarmac of the school playground, which tells you most of what you need to know about how it went when someone fell over. The game was at its most popular and most dangerous on hard surfaces, and the popularity and the danger were not unrelated. The appeal was precisely that it was physical in a way that most sanctioned playground activities were not. It involved contact, momentum, the thrill of committing fully to a sprint, and the equal thrill of being the person who stopped someone else's sprint, usually by grabbing, wrapping, lifting, or simply colliding with them at sufficient speed to bring them to the ground. On grass, that produced grazed knees and bruised elbows. On tarmac, it produced something more, and the children went back to it every lunchtime regardless, because the thing the tarmac added, the slight extra cost of getting it wrong, was also the thing that made getting it right feel like something worth doing. Nobody ran that hard in any other game. Several things happened that turned the game from a playground staple into a liability, and their effects compounded in ways that made the bans feel, in retrospect, almost inevitable. The first was the injuries. British Bulldog generated a steady accumulation of broken bones through the 1970s. Sprained wrists, fractured arms, the kind of injuries that came from falling on a hard surface at speed with someone on top of you. In June 1985, a spinal injury sustained during a game of British Bulldog was reported in the British Medical Journal, which was the kind of documentation that moved the conversation from playground gossip to institutional concern. Schools had been banning it individually since the 60s, quietly and without coordination, but the medical literature made those bans easier to justify and harder to reverse. Not a national ban. Never a national ban. 1,000 individual decisions made by head teachers that collectively amounted to the same thing. The second was the culture around risk and children. From the 1980s onward, the way British institutions thought about children's physical safety changed significantly, driven partly by genuine concern and partly by the expanding reach of liability. Schools were not just responsible for what happened in classrooms, they were increasingly responsible for what happened in playgrounds, and a game that reliably produced injuries was a game that produced paperwork, parents, and the possibility of being held accountable for something that a previous generation had considered an acceptable part of being 11. The phrase cotton wool society entered British public discourse during this period, used by those who argued that removing all risk from childhood was itself a form of harm. That children who were never allowed to fall over on a playground were being denied something that falling over on a playground had always quietly provided. The argument was made, the bans continued, the HSE was widely blamed for it, which the HSE itself consistently rejected. Their position, stated repeatedly, was that they had never recommended banning British Bulldog, that sensibly managed risk was the point of their work, and that children falling over in playgrounds was not something they had ever been in the business of preventing. The ban happened anyway. It happened because individual head teachers made individual decisions, and the direction of those decisions was consistent. By 2008, the local government association was actively encouraging schools to bring back traditional playground games, including British Bulldog, citing concerns about childhood physical activity and the replacement of unstructured play with supervised alternatives. A 2011 survey of teachers found that more than a quarter of respondents said the game had been banned at their school, so you had an official body saying, "Bring it back," and a quarter of schools saying it wasn't coming back. In 2014, Meeching Valley Primary School in New Haven, East Sussex, banned it following parent complaints that it had become too aggressive and that children were coming home bruised. That school's decision was covered in the national press, which tells you that by that point a single school banning British Bulldog was still considered news, which in turn tells you the ban was still not universal and the game was still being played somewhere. What the game had always been, underneath the injuries and the bans and the HSE blame and the parental complaints, was a specific kind of physical experience that no other playground game quite replicated. It was not a team game in the conventional sense. There were no fixed sides, no jersey to identify who you were running for. It was a game of individual survival inside a collective chaos, where your relationship to every other player changed with each crossing. Potential ally, potential threat, depending on whether they were bulldog or runner and which side of the line you were both on. Every round redistributed power. The last person standing had been the most elusive, the most strategic, or simply the fastest. And the recognition of that was entirely informal and entirely genuine, because there was no trophy and no referee and everyone there had seen it happen. What the game produced, and what no supervised activity quite replicated, was status earned in public, in real time, without an adult deciding who won. The child who got through when nobody else could became something in that playground, briefly and without ceremony. And that briefness and that lack of ceremony were the point. There was also something specifically valuable in the physical confrontation it required. British Bulldog asked children to make a decision under pressure, to read the middle of the field, identify the gaps, commit to a direction, and hold that commitment through contact. The child who hesitated at the line lost more often than the child who went. The child who went straight also lost more often than the child who went at an angle. These were not lessons anyone planned. They were the natural consequence of a game that rewarded spatial thinking, timing, and the willingness to accept a certain amount of physical cost in exchange for the chance of getting through. The child who came back from a failed crossing and tried a different angle the next time was learning something that no lesson plan had designed for them. Learning it in real time, at lunchtime, on a Tuesday, from the experience of getting it wrong, not a sport. A playground education that arrived without a curriculum, was administered without a teacher, and was assessed without a mark scheme. The only grade it gave was whether you got through or didn't, and you always knew which one it was. The non-contact version exists. Several schools that wanted to keep the spirit of the game while managing the injuries moved to a version where the bulldog tags rather than tackles, which is safer and considerably less interesting to the children playing it. A tag version of British Bulldog is a different game, in the same way that a non-contact version of rugby is a different game. The principle is the same, but the thing that gave it its particular electricity is gone. The children who played the original version would tell you this immediately and at some length if you asked them. Not British Bulldog. Tag with a different name, you can still play it. There is no national law against it, no HSE regulation banning it, nothing official that prevents a group of children from organising a game in a field on a Saturday afternoon. Adults do play it at charity events and company team days, usually with more protective equipment than 11-year-olds ever had, and considerably less speed. The game exists. The playground in which it lived as a daily institution, with the tarmac and the uneven surface and the teacher who looked the other way, is largely gone. Search for British Bulldog at any primary school near you tonight. There is a reasonable chance it is on their banned list. There is an equally reasonable chance that children are playing it anyway, at the far end of the field where nobody is looking. British Bulldog is still out there, in the memory of everyone who ever stood at that line wondering whether to go, and then went anyway. The tarmac, the person in the middle choosing their moment. the sprint that committed you entirely to something with no guarantee of getting through. It was built on the idea that some things are worth running at, even when the odds are against you, and that the experience of finding out either way was worth more than the safety of not having tried. It never needed to be more than that. Tell me in the comments, did your school ban it? Did you play it anyway? And what is the specific memory that comes back when you hear the name? If you found this worth your time, subscribing helps me know there's interest in these topics.